I've been playing when I started classical violin, at the same time Comanche. This is Persian fiddle or Comanche with skin, lamb skin, and the wood is walnut. It's been about 10,000 years old instrument, very old, not this one. Thank you very much for...
Thank you. My name is Mitra Khorsandi. We selected today the two songs from North Caspian Sea, Providence, and the first one is IRAN, which is, regarding the black cloud and shepherd. The second one is a love story, Ulisa, is the name of flower. من گشترم یوم نگیره خداوندان نگهدار نگین باشد یار اول و آخر همینه مجنون
The Peace and Economic Justice Committee of Brooklyn for Peace, who was incredibly helpful in doing everything that was needed to set this event up, and to Charlotte, Tara, and Lily for their extra special help. Brooklyn for Peace is a nonprofit organization that's been sadly of necessity working for peace for 34 years in Brooklyn. We have no corporate sponsors, and working for peace costs money. So at this time, I would like to ask you to, even though this event is free, if you could please donate some money to us. There are 2 people who are going to come around with buckets, and that would be extremely helpful for costs in renting this room and other expenses that we have. We would really appreciate it if you would do that. What do we do? Well, we have forums such as this one on a variety of different current events as they come up. We attend rallies and demonstrations in the city. We have other kinds of events, and we do tabling at street fairs very often, which is one of the most fun and successful things that we do. In fact, our next event will be at the Smith Street Sunday Fun Day on June 24th. We would love it if you could come and stop by and see us, or even help out at our table. We want the federal government to spend our tax dollars. And interestingly enough, it's never mostly for the Defense Department when the people choose. Another thing we do is we have a photo booth where people get to pose for the camera with messages for Congress. And if you are not signed up on our mailing list, please sign up before you leave. And we would, again, love to have you help out at any of these events. So, for people interested in extra information on Iran, we have a book table here. Medea Benjamin is in California with her latest book, Inside Iran, but OR Books has very kindly come and has some copies here for sale of Medea Benjamin's latest book. In addition, we have 5 copies left of Dan Kovalik's latest book, The Clock to Attack Iran, which we're selling for discounted cost. And our speaker, Ervand Abrahamian, has 2 books that we don't have for sale. We have display copies. One of them is A History of Modern Iran, and he's working on a 2nd edition of that book, which will be released in September. And the second is a book called The Coup, both of them extremely informative. And please feel free to stop by the book table and check them out. So, on our literature table, we have a very interesting article that Professor Abrahamian made available to us today that is very good reading. And among other points that it makes is the fact that for us as Americans especially, I think, we need to honor the right to self-determination of other sovereign nations, regardless of what is happening internally, politically. Apparently, when people came out and spoke against the fact that Trump pulled out of the Iran deal, there was a lot of criticism about things that are happening in Iran. Well, interestingly enough, the U.S. is a huge supporter of Saudi Arabia, which has far more human rights violations and a much worse situation than Iran does. But at any rate, people in Iran have the right to determine their own form of government, and that is a major point of this article. So I would highly recommend picking up a copy. In addition, the handout on your chair has a handy map on one side, but on the back, it talks about one of the things that you could do, because what's the point of having knowledge about what our government is doing in other countries if we don't do anything to try to stop it? So the suggestions on the back about calling Congress and pushing back for peace and telling them that people need to re-sign, we have a negotiated agreement, that was the Iran deal, and our government needs to honor that. And the second thing is not to push for sanctions on the people of Iran, which only causes huge suffering for the people in other countries, and I think we've done enough of that. So, I would now like to introduce our main speaker for the evening, who is Ervand Abrahamian, distinguished Professor Emeritus and author of many books, 2 of which are available for you to look at on the table. And that is all the introduction that you asked me to give. I could say a lot more.
Thank you, Anne. I want to just focus on 2 related questions. One is the reasons why Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal, and 2, what are the likely consequences of this withdrawal? A few weeks ago in May, Trump, during his presidential campaign, having declared the deal as the worst deal ever the United States has made, fulfilled his promise of withdrawing from the agreement. This has started really a collision course between US and Iran, which could very well end up with sort of military confrontation as a result. And I'll get to that towards the end of my talk. But the withdrawal of the agreement was a very drastic move in terms of traditional history of diplomacy. Here was an agreement the United States had made, not just with Iran, but with the United Nations. It was an agreement between Iran and 5+1, the 5 being the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council, being, of course, United States, Britain, France, Russia, China, +1 being Germany, because Germany was also very much involved in the whole issue of Iran. So this unilateral withdrawal was not just an act against Iran, but also a threat against the Europeans and also Russia and China. To compound the withdrawal, Trump also threatened to carry out major sanctions against Iran and also penalize financially any company, whether Russian, French, or European, or Chinese, that dealt with Iran. So it was a way of trying to isolate Iran from the international community as far as trade is concerned. Now, the reasons he gave for the withdrawal, avowed reasons, is something mentioned in the press or vaguely without actually dealing with the agreement itself. And Trump himself probably has not read the agreement, because at one point he said that the agreement would end in 7 years' time, and then Iran would have the liberty to develop a nuclear bomb. I don't know where he got this idea from, but if you read the actual agreement, which is very meticulous, it's over 100 pages, it's very precise. There are some sunset clauses in it. A few of the minor issues, there's a sunset 15 years, 25 years, but even after 25 years, actually, Iran would be still limited by the non-proliferation treaty it signed before. So this alarmist view that somehow as soon as the treaty ends, the limitations ends, Iran would have a carte blanche to develop a nuclear bomb is a complete, basically, mythology. Now, you find often actually people like Schumer, others complaining that the Obama's agreement was fine, except for there are some minor issues that should be dealt with, the one issue being this question of limitations. But if you look at it carefully, these limitations are not actually limited by 15 or 24 years. So it's a very alarmist view to say that, well, after a few years, Iran will have the absolute right to develop a nuclear bomb. But also, if you listened to Trump's speech when he withdrew, it's interesting, the nitty-gritty of it. In the speech, he doesn't talk about areas that the deal could be improved. He basically denounces the treaty, and the speech could be read as an explicit, basically, demand of surrender, unconditional surrender by Iran, or an implicit demand that it's a declaration of war. And maybe he hoped that this would have it be read in Iran as a declaration of war. Because there was no attempt to basically try to fine-tune the deal and say it's going to be a better deal. He says, I'm just withdrawing. If you then look at the pro-Trump press, but even the more responsible press over the last 10 years, they have managed to create an atmosphere of Iran as a major threat, as a major power, that it's actually has aspirations to build up a new empire like the old Persian Empire, reaching all the way from the Mediterranean to all the way to India. And they constantly talk about, well, the Iranians are fascinated by the old empire, and this is what they want to create, and this is what their ambitions are, and this is what they're going to do. Here we need a reality check, actually. If you look at the real military strength of Iran, it's pitiful. Iran has revolutionary guards, which are mostly like a national guard. They would be quite effective if a country invaded the country, but it has no outward capability. Iran's national budget per year for the military used to be $9 billion a year for the military. It's now increased to $14 billion a year for the military. The United Arab Emirates, a tiny sheikhdom, is a pumping station for the United States, spends $35 billion on its military. Saudi Arabia, our democratic ally, spends $95 billion a year. United States, of course, spends something like $700 billion. So here you have a midget Iran spending, let's say, $14 billion, is supposed to be a major threat to countries, neighboring countries that spend $95 billion. So to create this image of Iran as a major power, there's a lot of exaggeration put, and you find this, of course, in Trump's speech, that he ties any problem that exists in the Middle East, whether it's the Palestinian issue, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Syria, whether it's the Taliban in Afghanistan, to Iran, as if Iran is the mastermind of all these problems in it. So the view that is then created is, if you get rid of Iran, all these problems are going to be solved. This is very much reminiscent of the Iraqi situation. Although Trump criticized Bush about Iraq, or he claimed he did, the arguments constantly that are being used are very similar. It's like a leaf taken out of the Bush's book. of portraying now Iran, before it was Iraq, as a major threat, where the only threat Saddam Hussein had was to his own people. It was not a threat to anyone else. But the picture was portrayed that Saddam Hussein could destroy Manhattan with germ warfare in no time. Now the argument is that Trump actually cited that American cities could be destroyed by Iranian nuclear bombs. First of all, Iran, of course, doesn't have any nuclear bombs. It doesn't have the capability of having international missiles, but still this image is trying to be created in the United States that Iran is a major imminent threat, and that threat can directly affect the United States. So once you create that atmosphere and demonize the state, then of course it's easier then to move into more drastic action. Now the question becomes why this position is taken. Now I would venture 4 major reasons or pressures that explain this reversal or removal of it. One explanation often given is that, of course, Trump wants to undo all of Obama's achievements. And of course, Obamacare was his main achievement internally. In foreign policy, Obama's major achievement was actually the nuclear deal. And this is often stressed that this is basically the fixation of Trump, and this is why he is so adamant about it. I'm sure there is some truth in this, but I think this is more a convenient cover-up for more important reasons, and I'll get to it why this was convenient argument often used. Second reason, a much far more important reason, is basically the pressure from Israel. You can't understand US policy about Iran without putting the Israeli context in. When I say Israel, I'm talking about Bibi Netanyahu, not the whole of the Israeli political elite. Netanyahu has always denounced the agreement, and he always opposed actually Obama's dealings with Iran. His obsession about Obama was really about Iran, because for him, Obama, if he dealt with Iran, he was in fact undermining Israeli position in the Middle East. So even before the negotiations about the nuclear deal, he was adamant that there should be no deal. And Kerry has recently revealed that while he was negotiating, he was being constantly pestered by Bibi that he should end negotiations and instead bomb Iran. So that was his solution to how to deal with the situation. For Netanyahu, Iran's existence is what he called existential threat to Israel. Now, 27 leading generals in Israel, including some Mossad leaders, have actually signed this letter saying the nuclear deal was a good deal. And they actually supported the negotiations. So this is much more to do with Israeli politics, especially Likud versus opponents of Netanyahu about this issue. But Netanyahu has used this argument very much to appeal to the electorate in Israel as to show Iran, to depict Iran as an existential threat. And of course, Iran doesn't help sometimes by having demonstrations about death to Israel. That feeds into it. But these are mostly rhetorical statements in Iran, really, rather than serious policy decisions there. Now, added to the Israeli position, you also have in American politics major fundraisers, people like Adelson, owner of Home Depot, one important hedge fund manager, who have poured in more than $40 million for the Trump wing of the Republican Party. And all of these three people have had a long record of wanting to confront Iran. Adelson, in fact, in one time openly advocated that 8 million people in Tehran should be nuclear bombed by the United States. So he doesn't mince his words. He wants direct action, and he has a long record of this. And they have been very much behind opposing Obama and supporting Trump. There's an interesting article just this week in New Yorker that the main force that got Trump to move to accept Jerusalem as the capital of Israel wasn't so much Trump himself, but Adelson. Adelson insisted that this was something that had to be done basically to satisfy his Trump's promise to the pro-Likud, you could say, constituency in the United States. Now, the reason I would say that Trump's, the notion of Trump's obsession about Obama is convenient is again reminiscent of the Iraqi situation. If you go back to the Iraqi war, the people who most were adamant and were engineers of really the war were the pro-Likud neocons. But when it went sour, they quickly actually distanced themselves and said, oh, it was all due to Bush and Rumsfeld. They were the peoples behind it. And you even got them with a straight face saying, no, we didn't support the war. It was their ideas. So what you see now is that if there is things go sour, if there is a war, they can easily say, oh no, it was Trump's obsession about Obama that got you into the war. We had nothing to do with it. We were just observers. We even maybe advised you not to go along that road. So there is, I think, a very sort of cynical use of this argument of Obama's obsession to cover up the real force behind the confrontation. A third factor that is important is the Saudis plus the United Arab Emirates. They act now as a very effective lobby in Washington. They have poured billions of dollars into setting up so-called think tanks, spending money in important places, including the Trump family. There is no, basically, secret that there is a lot of money flowing into American businesses from the Gulf states. There was a 19th century philosopher who described the state as the executive committee of the ruling class. The modern version of this could be very well the executive committee of the global oligarchs. So it doesn't matter whether the oligarch is in Manhattan or St. Petersburg or United Arab Emirates or in Riyadh. They also have a direct access in influencing policy and determining policy. Now, why are they obsessed about Iran? Why do they want to attack Iran? And they, again, released new information that has come out, not only from Kerry, that while he was negotiating with the nuclear deal, the Saudis wanted him to attack Iran. And the WikiLeaks actually released one document where the ruler of Saudi Arabia said Iran was a snake, its head should be cut off by the United States. Gates recently revealed that when he went to Riyadh as the Secretary of Defense for Obama, he lost his cool in dealing with the Saudi leaders because it was clear that they treated America as mercenaries and they wanted American blood spilled for their interests. And he argued basically that America will go to war when it's in its interest, not in the interest of Riyadh. So here actually it's ironic because Obama was much more of America first than Trump, despite their claims. He was very concerned about if you go to war, it has to be in American interest. Here you have basically Trump beginning to go on a road to war on not really American interest, but Saudi interest, the United Arab Emirates. Now, what is their reason for the opposition? Well, there is a traditional rivalry in the Gulf between Iran and the Saudis. This goes back even under the Shah. But it has become more intense, mainly because after the Iranian Revolution, Khomeini reinterpreted Islam to be anti-monarchical. He even came up with the notion that true Islam had always been against monarchies. Of course, that's bullshit, but this was a new interpretation of the religion. And it didn't go so well with the Saudis, since their actual legitimacy is the monarchy. So this Republican versus monarchy fueled the national rivalries. But then added to that are other problems that have actually increased. One is that the US invasion of Iraq unleashed basically sectarian conflicts between Shias and Sunnis. Iran was not actually interested in that game. Iran, before the US invasion of Iraq, didn't push the idea of Shiism versus Sunni. They preferred to talk about Islam. But once the United States broke the state of Iraq and the communal rivalries, conflicts started, became very intense. You basically had ethnic cleansing in Iraq, thanks to the United States. This actually then led to the Saudis beginning to depict Iran as an aggressive Shiite state, threatening the Sunnis in the region, which again is sort of a completely off the wall, because in terms of size of population, state, and power, the Shias are still very much a minority in the region and not in a position to take over the whole of the area. But they talk about the Shiite crescent that's going to reach all the way from Iran to the Mediterranean. Another factor that has fueled this rivalry is, in the past, the Gulf states and the Saudis always acted or pretended to be the main defenders of the Palestinians. Their legitimacy is based on that they're protectors of Islam, they're protectors of the two holy cities, Mecca and Medina, and as Palestinians being predominantly Muslim, they have a duty to protect their smaller brothers. And this, of course, has now become more and more ridiculous, with the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates working very closely with this, not only the United States, with Israel. And this makes them very uncomfortable, because they can no longer present themselves at the forefront of the Arab cause. And this leads the opening for Iran, and this has happened in the last 10 years, to present itself as the main protector of the Palestinians. Iran really can't do much about the Palestinians on the ground, but in terms of appearance and propaganda, Iran has in fact taken that role, that they are at the forefront of protecting the Palestinian cause. And this seems, from the Saudi point of view, basically trespassing on their territory. What are these Iranians doing, interfering with Arab politics? The way to deal with them is you cut off the head because they're a snail, but that snake basically trespassing on our territory. So here what you really have is the Saudi policy, especially with the Crown Prince, very aggressively wanting action against Iran, but wanting the United States to take the action. Just my personal view is if the Saudis really feel threatened by Iran, it's then, okay, they're an independent country, they should then deal with Iran. Why should the United States have to do their dirty work? The same thing could be applied to Israel. If Israel really thinks Iran is an existential threat, they're welcome to deal with it. Why should the United States get involved with it? And one of the major reasons Obama wanted a nuclear agreement was that if there wasn't an agreement, Israel would attack Iran. This would create a chaos. Israel wouldn't be able to solve the problem. That would drag the United States into a war it really didn't want to. The fourth final reason for the pressure are basically a group of neocons, the people who brought us the great success of Iraqi liberation, are now in charge of very much the State Department, and they're fully now manning it with former neocons. And if you go back to their record, and there's no secret because they wrote a lot, there were no secret that their real enemy was in fact Iran. The phrases they used was Baghdad was the road to Tehran, that real men want to go to Tehran, not just to Baghdad, that they were out to destroy the Islamic Republic, and sometimes even more than that. If you look at deconstruct some of their statements, look at some of the maps they distribute about Iran, they see Iran as fragmented into a number of small sectarian mini-states. So their idea is not just the destruction of the Islamic Republic, it's more the destruction of Iran as an entity, because they see Iran as basically a state, a large enough state that could be a problem for the United States. Here, the old explanation would be, of course, it's U.S. imperialism wants to control the Middle East. Well, we don't use words like imperialism, it sounds old-fashioned, but if you look at it in a question of power, what you're saying here is the United States wants to be the dominant, the hegemon in the Middle East. It can tolerate countries that submit to it, but if any country doesn't submit to it, then it has to be eradicated to teach others a lesson. And this was true of Iraq, this was true of Gaddafi, was true of Assad, and it's true of Iran now. So the idea is that Iran has crossed the United States, it has not obeyed United States, it has even vehemently opposed the United States. For the neocons, the way to deal with that is to actually destroy Iran or attack Iran. And added to this is that many of these neocons, especially Bolton, Gingrich, what you find in their recent past is they've been working very closely with the cult group called the Mujahideen, who they now prefer to use the MEK because the Mujahideen has other flavors to it, and they don't want to be associated with the so-called Muslim crusaders, so they call themselves MEK. For a long time, the MEK was categorized as a terrorist organization by the United States. It's no longer categorized that, and I don't like the term terrorist because it's sort of obviously a loaded term and has many different aspects. But it's clearly a cult organization, a religious cult, where its members basically obey anything its leader tells them to. To give you one example, one morning the head of the Mujahideen, Rajavi, he is considered the imam among them, imam of the present age. He got up and told everyone that was a member had to divorce their wives. And then they could remarry, but he would appoint who was to be your next spouse. So what could be more cultish than this? Now, this cult, for a long time, got a lot of money from Saddam Hussein. It actually fought Iran on behalf of Saddam Hussein. When Saddam Hussein fell, it then got its contacts with the Saudis. It now gets unlimited funds from the Saudis. So it is able to have basically a lot of cash to spread around, and it organizes every year major meetings in Paris, where you see actually interesting figures from the United States appearing there, including Gingrich, Bolton, and so on. Bolton apparently until now was getting $40,000 a year from the Mujahideen. Then there are also the royalists from the monarchists from the old regime in the United States. They also want to get into power into Iran. Obviously they can't do it on their own. What they want is the United States to do their deal. They're like the Chalabis and Makias of the Iraqi crisis. They want basically an occupation of the country where then they would be brought back and the restoration of the monarchy. And the Mujahideen want, of course, the Mujahideen. In fact, just a week before Trump withdrew from the deal, Bolton spoke to a Mujahideen meeting in Washington, and he promised them by this time next year you will be celebrating in Tehran. And here is the future State Department head making a promise to a cult that they're going to be in power in Tehran within a year. So these things are not a secret. These are basically all in the open. Now, what the argument of the neocons and the people who have designed this strategy of withdrawal is the argument that the logic is that if you put very strong sanctions on Iran, economic sanctions, the system is going to crumble. Why? Because it is weak, it is a failed state, it's a dictatorship, it's corrupt and all everything else. And all you need to do is a little huffing and puffing, bring in some sanctions, and the system will crumble on its own. And this is basically a false premise. Again, it's very similar to the Iraqi thing that once US moved in, people are going to greet the liberators as their bringing their freedom. Here the notion is that there is so much resentment, opposition, criticism of the regime in Iran that a little basically tightening of screws is going to bring the whole thing down. The problem with that premise is that although in Iran there is a lot of problems, there are, when you look at human rights issues, it's very mixed, it's very bad on individual rights, but when you come to actually a question of social rights, it's pretty good actually over the last 30 years. The regime, how one dislikes it or not, has achieved a tremendous amount in terms of expansion of education, medical facilities, electrification, road building, housing, slum clearance. If you look at the budget under the Shah, 18% of the budget went to the military. Now 4% of the budget goes to the military. The reason is much of the oil resources for the last 30 years have gone into social programs. So however you be critical of the regime on individual rights, when you look at statistics such as education, especially health, life expectancy in Iran now is better than the United States. It's not saying much, of course. It's not saying much, but it is saying much if you compare it to before the Islamic Revolution. So although people might have objections, criticisms of the regime, on the whole, people are not so opposed to the regime that they want a return of the monarchy, or they want the coming to power of a cult group like the Mujahideen, who are even more strict about Islamic codes and stuff than the Islamic State is. Another factor that is very important to understand the regime is not fragile is Iran is not an artificial state created by colonialism and imperialism in the 19th, 20th century. Iran, unlike most third world countries, is much more like China, not as big as China, but it has a long history, not as long as the 10,000 of the instrument, but 2,500-year history. So this has created a strong national identity. It's not a system that's going to collapse or break up like Iraq did, because there is a strong Iranianism or Iranian identity. And this identity is reinforced not just by a long history, but there is the Zoroastrian culture that actually seeps into folk culture and is still very important. Then you have, on top of that, you have Shia Islam that again creates a much more of a homogeneous society. And then, and these whole things actually undermine the notion that nation states are a new creation of the West. Iran and China especially don't fit into that category. There's a long you can say, history that has created a strong national identity. And then if you look at recent events, 20th century events that have added to this national cohesion. So Iranians may often conflict about politics, but there is strong still identity and common history that bonds them together. Just to give you two recent events that have done that. One is the 1953 coup. This 1953 coup is a major event for Iran because the reason for the coup was that Iran, under the popular Prime Minister Mossadegh, nationalized the main company, the British oil company. And this wasn't just an economic issue, this was a much more a national issue. Iran at that time was not colonized by the British, but it could be considered as a semi-colonial state, in that real power lay with the British and the British oil company. And by nationalizing the oil company, it was a way of Iran declaring its independence against the British, against the West. So Mossadegh wasn't just seen as a person who nationalized the oil company, but someone who brought independence to Iran by throwing out the British oil company. And this was how it was seen actually both in Iran and Britain in 1951 when the oil company was nationalized. When he was overthrown by the CIA, this was seen as a reversal, a great undermining of national sovereignty, national independence. This was more than just a change of a government, a coup. It was seen as going back to a semi-colonial period, except for now United States replaced Britain as the imperial power. So this becomes a dominant event in recent Iranian history. And when you move forward to the 1979 revolution, again, some common factor that affected most Iranians, whether they liked it or not, it becomes a central event of 20th century. The revolution was not just an Islamic revolution, it's termed an Islamic revolution. It was also a national revolution because the masses of people who participated in it saw this as a way of regaining independence that was lost in 1953. This was like a reversal of the coup, going back to the Mossadegh era of becoming independent again. Except for here, the enemy was no longer Britain, it was much more United States, because the United States was seen as the power behind the Shah and the monarchy. And this revolution actually is a major phenomenon in modern history. If you look at the mass participation in the revolution, it's been estimated it had more per capita mass participation than any other revolutions, including the French or the Russian Revolution. It really participated, brought in the millions of people into the street, all crying down with the Shah, get rid of the Shah, and also implicit in that was get rid of the United States, because the United States was seen basically as the power behind the Shah. So these events have all actually, I think, created in Iran a very strong national awareness, a national consciousness that is not going to be brought down just by sanctions and huffing and puffing in Washington. Added to all this is another factor that people try to minimize, especially in the United States, because the state in the United States is often considered the problem, the enemy. In Iran, actually, the state is seen as this place that you get aid that supposed to provide certain beneficiaries, sort of social services. And the Iranian state, despite all its problems, is actually been very effective as a bureaucracy. If you look back during the Iraqi war, when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, 8-year war, Iran's economic crisis was very acute. The oil prices also hit rock bottom. I think they fell something from $40 a barrel to about $6 a barrel. The country was really on its legs economically, but the state survived by introducing a very effective a rationing system, distribution system. There was an efficiency bureaucracy to do that, very much like Britain during World War II. And this is something that is very important when you're looking at so-called failed states. Failed states don't have centralist effective states. In Iran, there is an effective state, and it can deal with some economic hardships. So, what's the likely outcome once these U.S. has withdrawn and imposed strict sanctions? Well, the expectation is that the regime would crumble. I'm arguing the regime is not going to crumble. So what's the next stage? Okay, the Iranian side has alternatives. And the Iranian state actually is, and even in decision making, is quite rational and even more actually rational than the present American state. In foreign policy, decisions are not made by the supreme leader. There's a National Security Council that advises him, that discusses this. And in the council are basically the heads of all the major institutions, the army, the foreign ministry, the presidency, the economic sectors. They all have an input on how to deal with it. So when the Trump ultimatum came, I think Trump expected them to read it as a declaration of war and basically say, well, US has declared war, we're going to go to war with the United States. This is something what the neocons would want. Actually, they kept their cool. They said, well, our agreement is not just with the United States, it's with the United Nations and the 5+1. We will negotiate as if it is with Europe, with China and Russia. And basically puts the ball in their court to see what they're going to do. So they didn't act irrationally, but highly, you could say, calculated in a diplomatic way. The problem now is then, how are the other countries going to react? Europe has obviously objected to Trump's actions. They have objected to the threats of penalties on European companies trading. But they're unlikely to actually go confront United States on this issue, for the obvious reason that most of the European companies do more trade with United States than with Iran. So if they have to face the choice, they would obviously have no choice to prefer United States. What they might try to do is to basically find some seepage, some agreement with the Trump administration that certain goods could be sold. There could be basically agreement. There was limitations on what they would do, so that this would water down the pain of the sanctions. But this, of course, then would undermine the real aim of the sanctions, is to hurt the regime as much as possible. So there's at the moment the negotiations between the Europeans and America about how are the sanctions going to be implemented. Iran could also do another thing while they're waiting, hoping that Europeans will actually deliver, but also they're realistic enough to know that Europeans can't deliver. So what will they do? And this will then open up Iran to real politics. Iran, unlike some of countries such as the Gulf countries, does have politics. It has elections every 4 years for presidency, for parliament, for local councils. And although these elections are not completely free, they're not completely free in any country, but in Iran there's always very real competition between the so-called moderates and more conservatives, right-wing fellows, people who could be seen as a mirror image of Trump, like the former president Ahmadinejad was very much that character. So there is competition, and it could very well be that in these elections, the people who will come to power are more hardliner allies, not Ahmadinejad himself, but some cronies of him. And they would be much more basically active, much more intransigent. And they could easily say, well, we always told you so. They're always saying, don't trust America. They're always going to try and cheat you. They always oppose the deal in the first place. So they say, history has proven right. The moderates were wrong to even negotiate with Obama. Pull out. And they have a right to pull out since already the United States has pulled out. So they'll say politely to the UN inspectors that, we no longer need you, please leave. They will have no choice to leave. And then the world is not going to know what's going to happen inside the nuclear installations. This was, of course, a nightmare for Obama. If you have no inspections, then Iran could be easily developing or going towards developing a bomb. So once the inspections are thrown out, then the danger is that Iran is then on the fast track to building nuclear bombs. Then the question becomes, what does US do or Israel does? Then the temptation would be to actually start bombing the nuclear installations. There's no other choice, but that may not solve the problem because some of the nuclear installations are hidden well underground. And also, by bombing, it's going to unify the country and make the country actually more intransigent rather than change of regime. So they might get a change of regime, but not the type they wanted. They will replace the Rouhani government that's fairly moderate with a much more die-hard right-wing regime. They should be careful what they wish for when it comes to this. So the bombing will not then really solve the problem. You'd have then have to have more bombing to give more pay, maybe urban bombing of cities. That's not going to solve, because in most, we know it from history, when you bomb a country, it doesn't bring down the government, it strengthens the government, because even people, critics of the government, are then rally behind the government. Then down the road, they have to face the question, the only way then they could solve the problem is actually invade the country. And if you think that Iraq was a mess, you just have to realize the size of Iran and the situation in Iran is much different. Iraq had a population of 23 million. It was a highly divided society. The Kurds, in fact, supported the US invasion. The US had to use 400,000 troops to occupy the country, and that wasn't enough, actually. If you're going to occupy Iran, a population of 80 million, which is a much more solidified population, it really needs more than 1 million troops. This would really mean actually the return of conscripted national service to form an army to have such an occupation. So it basically becomes a nightmare, a sloping nightmare into a drastic situation. Obama actually just last week said in a statement when he read about the Trump thing, he says, without the deal, the US could eventually be left with a losing choice between a nuclear-armed Iran or another war in the Middle East, which I think is a realistic assessment of the future. So I'll stop there.
The critical factor, I think, is what Turkey and Russia will do, whether they will oppose American and Israeli assault on Iran, or whether they will support it. Even if they remain neutral, it puts Turkey and Russia in a very difficult situation. It means that they will be completely surrounded by American and Israeli military forces. And so I don't think they can avoid getting into the war. And it's a question then, and then the second question is, what if America just decides, Israel just decides to nuke Iran? If we kill 40 million of them, that might be a stunning blow, you know, shock and awe and all that sort of thing.
The first question was about the Russian position. Formerly, of course, Russia criticized the Trump administration for pulling out of the agreement. They were part of the agreement. But we really don't know how they're going to act as the crisis escalates. They have good relations with Iran, but they're not really have a treaty of alliance. And they're not obliged to actually come into the defense of Iran. This is a different situation from the Cold War. From 1921 until the fall of the Soviet Union, Iran always had an umbrella, which was the Soviet Union. It had a treaty with the Soviet Union that if any third country invaded Iran, the Soviet Union had a right to invade Iran, actually. And this gave it a protection both during the Islamic Revolution and earlier. That treaty is no longer there. The Soviet Union is not there. But how the Russians are going to actually react is up in the air. Again, you're dealing with not so much as states as oligarchs. maybe some Russian oligarchs, including
And they're all
Putin,
Jewish.
may decide that, in fact, their bread is buttered on with Trump and with the Saudis. In fact, they've had very good relations with the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates recently. So they may find it to take, and they've got good relations with Israel too. So they might find it convenient not to get involved. I don't think the US would have to worry about Russia's reaction.
Wow.
Turn down the
Are there any other questions?
Hey Sam, can you just turn down the stage mic? It's echoing.
Yeah, it says an echo over there somewhere.
Thanks for breaking things down for us. Would you go just a little bit deeper for us by keeping things as simple as possible? Let's realize that we're going to be in a conflict. We'll start talking about culture and people's ethnicity. We're going to have problems. Can we just get to the bottom line? The question is, if you were us living in either one of these countries, what would you want us to do as smart, intelligent Americans? What would you want us to do? Besides for our culture, being black, being Jewish, being anything. Tell us, what would you advise us to do, want us to do as someone suffering in one of these countries that you identify? Please keep it simple for us, because we are getting too confused on how to stop this war that you speak of as being something that's going to happen. As long as we are that dumb and we're going to send millions of people over to fight a war in Iran again, I think we need some real simple stuff to keep us from being stupid.
Well, I think the best thing we can do is use our common sense. Okay. The best thing that we do is use our common sense when we're fed information.
I don't know if that mic is working. I don't know if that mic is working. It doesn't sound like it's working.
See if you turn the switch off.
This one works, right?
Yeah.
They're both working.
Turn it towards you.
Yeah. I mean, the best thing is we can do is be actually educated audience and listen, first of all, to information. So much of the information when it comes to crisis situations is nowadays called fake news. But fake news is nothing new. It's always there, especially in foreign policy. So one has to be very careful on judging the information and always be skeptical about it. So when the president gets up and says, well, Iran might nuke our cities, you have to test, what's he talking about? You know, where's this information? Does Iran have nukes? Does it have the missiles to nuke us? It's simple facts like that as a citizen has to do, is to be aware when people are talking bullshit. And then from then you can criticize the policy. But you first of all have to recognize that it's nonsense. And of course we went through this with the Iraqi. Before that we went through the Vietnam. And really, I don't think basically nothing was learned from it. It was any administration comes in, the view is that the masses are asses. You can really fool them into anything.
Right. So how do we say no right now before the war even gets started? How do we say no emphatically to our government? We will not be part of this right now, not wait till later. No, let's not wait. How do we say it right now as citizens? Because we got you and those countries depend on us to say no now, so they know not to dare try that method of going to war.
The best thing we could do is, I mean, there's no war emergency. No one's talking about war. The best thing we can do is what we're doing now is point out that the policy, the road they've already set, is going to lead to war. So people's awareness what lies down the road. So they don't suddenly wake up one day and discover the prices have gone up.
At that point, we're already in war. At that point, we're in war.
Could you say something about the strategic interests of the United States
in targeting Iran. I look at the map. It's not too far from Russia. The U.S. strategic military focus has shifted to the east. That's public knowledge. Isn't Iran in the way? And is it so? Otherwise, how do you explain targeting this country that doesn't really present a military threat to the United States or the United States interests, but it's in the way of getting to Russia and China?
I think the concept of strategic areas might have been true like in the Great Game, 19th century, even in 20th century. Nowadays, with modern technology and missiles, space, I don't think the military really thinks in terms of that is important, that you need Iran to be able to weaken this Russia. I think that the vehement opposition to Iran is not about strategic. I don't think oil is an issue either. I think it's a question of power. U.S. is a dominant power, can't tolerate any state that crosses it. So if any state crosses it, it has to be beaten down, given as a lesson to others that if you do that, this is what will happen to you. And then the only way that those countries have actually, as a way of forestalling that, is actually Kim's solutions, North Korea's solution. You don't mess around with people who have nuclear weapons. And that's what actually the sort of the right wing in Iran, the Ahmadinejad's line would have been if they'd articulated it. They were too smart not to articulate it, but that was their position. And they're taking the moderates to task on this issue. I mean, they're saying, if we had nuclear weapons, Trump wouldn't mess around with us like this.
Hi, could you talk about the role of Qatar in all this and the alliance between Iran and Qatar and what and how that's playing out?
Again, here you see actually a question of composing of power. Qatar was part of the Gulf Defense Corporation, which was created by the United States to bring in the Gulf states, the Saudis, against Iran. But Qatar basically developed its own foreign policy that was somewhat friendlier to Iran, not really that close to Iran, but it didn't go along toe the line with the Saudis. The Saudis then got furious. How dare you, tiny little state, cross us? So we're going to teach you a lesson. We're going to blockade you. So it's a way of basically imposing, acting like a hegemon, U.S. hegemon, but a local hegemon on Qatar. But Qatar doesn't have military power, but it does have enough money to survive. And an embargo there hasn't worked because it has access from Iran to Iran. And there are also other complications. There's, of course, U.S. The largest U.S. naval base in the world is actually in Qatar. So it makes sense for the United States strategically to support Qatar rather than Saudis. But Trump didn't know that probably. And then what the Qataris have done actually is invited a lot of Turkish troops to come in. So if the Saudis try to invade, they're going to have to deal with the Turkish army there.
there are several strings of different things happening, and I want your comments on how they fit in. One is I'm wondering if the reason that Trump is having, all this supposed peace with North Korea is to get that out of the way so they can focus on Iran. That's one question. Another thing, I think Russia is going to be a bigger factor in all this. One aspect is, this obsession that the Democrats seem to have in it, which I don't entirely understand, and I originally thought it was that they thought that was the best way of getting rid of Trump, by focusing on his ties with Russia. And I don't know if that's the reason. There were a lot of other reasons that were brought up at the Left Forum this past a couple of weeks ago. But anyway, and I think one of the most effective political arguments that is going to be made in favor of attacking Iran is their role with Russia in Syria. So I guess I'm interested in what your view is on what's happening in Syria and why Russia is there, why Iran is there, and what you think should happen. I mean, my understanding of why Russia and Iran are there is because they're being engulfed by the U.S. from every side. So this is like one way of fighting the U.S., like a proxy war, as Phyllis Spence would put it. So I guess I'd like to know your views on Syria.
All right, first about North Korea. I don't think really it's related that way. What I think they probably think in Washington is the crisis with Iran is a long-term thing. It's not going to happen in the next 6 months or a year. It's something basically go in the next 2 years. So by then, they would have some sort of face-saving solution about North Korea. Okay, so the North Korean situation would have been resolved before the Iranian crisis really blows up. The Syrian situation, actually a bit hard. I did need a lot of time to explain because the media here has completely distorted it, including the responsible press. The media here presented the Syrian crisis as a popular uprising against a vicious dictator. Okay, Assad is a dictator, but when you put it in that perspective, automatically the notion is the people opposing the dictator are good guys. But if you know anything about Syria, that was a very dubious premise to start with. True, the first demonstrations were done by basically, we could call them secular reformers and stuff. But the movement was quickly taken over by jihadists. So the question then is, do you support a brutal secular dictator, Assad, or do you like to support a bunch of jihadists who want to cut off heads? And their slogan was Christians to Lebanon, Alavis to the grave. Okay. So it's a sectarian conflict. And when you're faced with that choice, who are the good guys? And the notion here was somehow U.S., at least the humanitarian interventionist, was that U.S. had a sort of duty mission to support the opposition without really looking at who is the opposition. And the opposition then broke into two. One group were the caliphate, okay, Mosul, ISIS is called, I prefer to call them the caliphate, that's what their name was, and why not call them the caliphate? And then the good guys were the bin Ladenists, Al-Qaeda, the guys who gave us September 11th, become then, they changed their name conveniently, probably advice of Washington. We had a new face and were then presented as the real force against Assad. But they were as much jihadists as the caliphate. So in that choice, the Russians actually, having experienced in Lebanon, what had happened in Lebanon, they had supported Gaddafi, and what they thought they would actually replace Gaddafi with something reasonable. What happened in Syria became a complete mess. They therefore didn't want to be burnt again in Syria, and they had also traditional links with Syria. So they didn't want to lose that. Iran's situation is actually even deeper. Iran has had good relations with Syria since 1980. When Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, the only major Arab country that didn't support Iraq was Syria. So they have that basically attachment to Assad. Even though Assad is a secular socialist, Arab nationalist, Iran is a Muslim Shia state, that religious issue wasn't there. It was quite political. Here was a state that had supported Iran. Iran therefore needed to support them. And also, Iran to support Hezbollah had to use the transit of Syria. And then when the civil war started in Syria, the jihadists were out to destroy all the Shiite shrines. There aren't many Shias in Syria, but they're important shrines, graves in Syria. And for Iran, this then became, you can say, an emotional issue. And their argument was they're sending volunteers, not so much to support Assad, but to defend these shrines. So at present in Syria, again, this idea that Iran is a major power, that Iran is really controlling Syria. Iran is a hegemon in Syria. That's often the term is used. Iran has 2,000 military advisors in Syria. So if 2,000 makes them a hegemon, then obviously the United States must control the whole world many times over. What also Iran does is to defend those sites and helps Assad. They have tried to get volunteers from other Shia communities, from Iraq and from Afghanistan and even Pakistan as volunteers to go to Syria. So they do spend some money on that, but it's not huge expenses. Again, the idea in Washington is if you financially squeeze Iran, they'll have no choice but to withdraw from Syria, as if Iran is pouring billions of dollars into Syria. It doesn't cost much to pay volunteers to fight in a country. So basically, it's not high-tech, expensive. People volunteer. What it is, you have to pay basically benefits if they're killed to their relatives. Again, you're not talking about big bucks. You're talking about money that any state can spend.
I would basically add a couple of other points, especially in Syria, that most of the opposition is supported by Saudi Arabia financially and by the United States, both financially and military. United States has bombed Syria many times and killed a lot of people. So the United States is not just an innocent bystander looking for a democracy around the world.
No, also, I mean, the Syrian case was very badly covered, even by the New York Times. The money that poured in, I mean, you could see this, the jihadists had unlimited weaponry, and it was all coming from the Gulf, but it was also American weaponry. Okay, the State Department would say, well, we know nothing about this. The fact is, when a country buys American weapons, they have to sign an agreement that they're not allowed to pass on the weapons to another country or another. So they either were breaking that contract or doing it with the permission of the State Department. And then you see actually the escalation of the crisis in Syria. That when do the Russians really come in? They come in when suddenly the jihadists had an unlimited supply of anti-tank weapons. These were American anti-tank weapons. When that came in, it changed the balance because it meant that the Syrian army that relied on tanks was very vulnerable. At that point, the Russians came in with their air cover to protect the tanks. So there has been escalation in Syria, mainly basically driven by the Gulf and United States, and the Russians and also Iranians have been reacting to that. If that hadn't been that tremendous inflow of American weaponry, Assad would have dealt with the crisis in the first 6 months. Gaddafi would have done the same thing. But it was only due to outside intervention that the crisis became a full-blown crisis. So what is ironically saying is the example is used that Iran, proof of Iran's expansionism is its presence in Syria. Iran's presence in Syria is mainly due to American and the Gulf intervention there. If it hadn't been that, Iran wouldn't have had a foothold in Syria, really. And the same goes along, of course, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and also in Lebanon. The Lebanese Hezbollah was created because of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Before that, there was no Hezbollah. So if you wanted to get rid of Hezbollah or dissolve Hezbollah, the Israelis should basically give assurances to Lebanon that they will never again invade Lebanon, which is not, they're not likely to give that pledge.
Well, Iran and Russia is not completely humanistic in Syria. Like Russia has a big base in Syria, and Iran also wants to be close to Israel as far as border and attacking. But anyway, my question is, what is the relationship of Iran with Turkey and Afghanistan? If you could talk a little bit about, where they stand today.
Well, with Turkey, it's basically ambiguous because Iran doesn't really know what Turkey is going to do. Turkey sometimes is supporting Assad, sometimes is not supporting Assad. At one time, Turkey was out to destroy Assad. Now they watered that down. So there's less friction about Iran and Turkey about that. With Afghanistan, Iran worked with the United States in setting up the Kabul government against the Taliban. Now, the rumor in Washington is that Iran is negotiating with the Taliban, as this is seen as a sign of sinister activities. But of course, the US is also dealing with the Taliban. So it's not like some sort of very Machiavellian thing to do with the Taliban. If you want some sort of settlement in Afghanistan, you have to deal with the Taliban. So what Iran is doing is probably has contacts with the Taliban and wants to see what's happening there. And of course, here is the one card Iran has, which I didn't deal with in the talk. If things escalate, besides Iran then throwing out the inspectors and going full-blown for nuclear, as a less of a drastic act, Iran can actually then needle United States in its weakest points. US is weak really in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon. And in all those countries, Iran has so-called assets, and it doesn't have major power. It doesn't have armies there, but it does have influence to undercut US role. So I wouldn't be surprised if things get worse, nasty things begin to happen to American troops in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, Lebanon. They would be vulnerable. And this is, I think, one reason the Pentagon is much more cautious about dealing with Iran. They don't want their troops basically used as hostages in a very hostile environment. And Iran could easily unravel the government in Afghanistan, basically the drop of a hat if it wanted to. So if it wanted to have a scene where, like the Vietnam scene with helicopters over the rooftops, evacuating people from Kabul, it can actually do that because it has enough assets in Afghanistan to do it.
Wow.
So that's one trump card Iran could play if things get worse. Going back to actually the question of the base. The base, I don't think that was that important to the Russians. It's an old base. It's more like a worn-out dock. It's not a major naval base. Once the escalation started, the Russians in Syria came in for air bases rather than a naval base.
But still, it's access to water. I mean, it's an important access.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but I think they would have other accesses too. I don't know. I know that the Navy is not that important for the Russians. The Air Force is there.
I probably could speak without the microphone. Doctor, I hope I understood you correctly when you said it's not Israel, but it's Netanyahu and the Likud party who are instigating the United States. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Suppose they turn around because they're in the Knesset, the Likud has 30 seats. But also like a person like Avi Gabay, Tzipi Livni, etc. People like that would form a coalition. It's a bicameral government. And if they were to turn that around and have a Labour prime minister where they would then look for peace, would that help the situation?
It would, but it would have to be a miracle.
I see.
I don't believe in miracles.
Okay.
First, I'd like to thank you for that excellent presentation and analysis. That was really, I thought, very much. A couple of things I would like to, call attention to is I would expect that what would happen with Iran is what Israel has already tried to do, which is to provoke Iran's presence in Syria, where Israel claimed that it was Iranian forces in Syria that had attacked Israeli forces, which the Syrians then said, no, that was us. So I think we all need to be on the alert for false flags, for attempts at provocation of Iran. And, Syria to me is like a cauldron. I mean, people, a lot of people talk about that this looks like World War I all over again. And I think it's a very complicated situation. I think the main thing that we need to do is to continually challenge the official story, wherever, whether in letters, getting on the radio, this kind of thing, writing articles, and speaking to people to reject the official story that Iran is any kind of a threat to the United States, and that it's the United States that's the greatest threat to world peace.
I wanted to go back to another base, and that's our Fifth Fleet in Qatar, and also if you look at the map that came with the flyer for tonight, it's about a dozen U.S. military facilities ringing or along the western side of the Persian Gulf. So I'm wondering, certainly historically that was a crucial sea route for oil tankers and whatnot. But you seem to suggest that oil is really not much of a factor. I understand your idea about the U.S. projecting power, geopolitical power, whatnot, military power. But then why so many bases? Is it just to encircle Iran and threaten them, or is it to interdict oil at crucial moment? What are all those bases really about?
It's a good point, because actually I've heard military experts saying during the Obama administration, saying that those bases basically are no longer needed. What's the point of them? They're expensive. They're not serving any function, and basically we should withdraw. And I think Obama's long-term strategy was when he said U.S. footsteps in the Middle East should be less, it was about reducing those bases. For him, the strategic areas for the United States was the Pacific, not the Persian Gulf. So I think in a way it's a sort of a hangover from the past when oil was important, and there was an obsession that somehow American oil was drying up, and the only way for national security in America was to have access and secure oil routes, Persian Gulf. But I don't think that important these days, because there's so many other sources of oil. Even if the Gulf was cut off, there's still, the Middle East oil could come out elsewhere. There's so many pipelines.
Excuse me. Don't you think that if United States goes against Iran, is it working?
Yes.
Don't you think that it may find itself alone? Meaning that so far United States has been waging wars always with NATO, always with the alliance, the North Atlantic Alliance, with Europe. So Europe has always followed the United States on these wars. But now Europe is giving signs that they begin to be fed up with Trump, and they are looking for their own policy, independent from the United States. And there are voices in Europe demanding withdrawal of each corner of the country that complains, demanding to withdraw from NATO. So I think that the United States may find itself alone without any support or any allies if it pretends to go against Iran.
I agree that when there is a war, Europe is not going to support or actively U.S. But I think in the Iraqi situation, NATO did not actually support. It was known as the Alliance of the Willing. But that didn't include NATO. It included a few countries, major countries like Georgia or Albania. But the French, of course, did NATO actually take a position on Iraq?
I don't think it took a formal position, but the individual European countries didn't go in. They cleaned up afterwards.
Yeah, but because Bush after the mess went to the UN and said, this is your mess, but they didn't actually participate in the invasion. So I don't think that is going to stop the US attacking Iran. But the consequences are actually, if you look down the road, especially in this question of sanctions, what U.S. has now is a tight grip over the international financial system. So that any country, any company that wants to deal with a country that's under sanctions, Iran or so on, it can be really throttled by the United States because the U.S. controls so much of international monetary system. And that is going to cause the Europeans to think about the present monetary system. Sooner or later, they're going to come to the decision that the monetary system that was set up after World War II, where the center of gravity of economics was the United States, US banks were dominant, was the normal, that is no longer true. Economic gravity has moved to China. There are so many other basically economic centers. And the banking system is a vestige already in the 1950s. And there would be, I think, serious talk about system that the dollar and the American banks are not going to be there. Because here, let's say you're a French company and you want to deal with Iran, you can't because you'll be penalized because the US banks could penalize you. So what sort of sovereignty does France have if that is true? So this is not going to save Iran in the short run, but in the long run, you're going to eventually get a sort of maybe a de Gaulle of France that will say, well, it's time to break off ties with the dollar. We need a different economic system where we can be much more independent of the United States. But I mean, it's been building up because more and more European countries have got pissed off because they can be really penalized with billions of dollars of penalties because they do something that politically Washington doesn't like.
We have time for one more question.
I'm flattered.
Make it good. So, given what you described as sort of the cultural and political unity in Iran, even though they might be leftists or hardliners and not so hardliners, why do you think it is that the Ayatollah and others make such provocative statements about, you know, well, we have to get rid of Israel or whatever it is that they do? I mean, it just doesn't seem like it's in their best interest to do that.
It's not in the long-term interest, but you can say the rhetoric is useful because then they can present Iran as a major protector of the Palestinians. Okay. And this is, of course, the needles the Saudis, because they want to be the main protector. So it's a lot of course, rhetoric rather than action, because Iranian volunteers that were sent to Lebanon and Syria, even under Khomeini, had explicit instructions not to actually engage with Israelis. He didn't want war with the Israelis. So the engagement is rhetorical.
But weighed against what it does internationally in terms of how people understand them, and against the Palestinians who presumably understand the Iranian support, it doesn't seem to balance.
But you know, even when periods when Iran has been lowered the rhetoric, like under Khatami, he was even willing to recognize two-state solution. He shook hands with the Israeli ambassador and stuff. That didn't decrease the Israeli government's vehemency. So it's a two-way problem. So Iranians use the rhetoric, but the Israelis use the rhetoric equally.
Can we start saying Israeli government and stuff? We can start saying the different governments, because it's not the people, man. We being played. Every last one of them being played by governments. We have to get this straight.
Well, I mean, here it does affect the people, because I think the rhetoric, someone in Israel hears the rhetoric that Israel has to be destroyed.
Or here.
Yeah, the Israeli citizen takes that personally, unless you know that it's rhetoric. You actually then react to it. So for that reason, it's not a smart idea to do it.
What about when Adelson said that we should nuke Iran?
Yeah.
That's right. It's really Israel who's doing it, and it's a response by Iran.
But of course, Bibi could say, well, I'm not saying it, he's saying it. But if the two are working together, from the Iranian point of view, Israel is a threat. Much more of a threat than Iran is a threat to Israel.
Thank you again, Professor Ervand Abrahamian. And I'd like to ask everyone to please check out the books that we have here, including Professor Abrahamian's 2 books. OR Books has Medea Benjamin's book on Inside Iran, and we have Dan Kovalik's book, The Plot to Attack Iran. In addition, I think the question that was asked before about what we can do is something that we really need to address. On the back of the flyer, there is one suggestion, which is calling your congresspeople and urging them to have the government, to demand that the government reinstate the Iran agreement, that we want no sanctions against Iran. In addition to that, educating ourselves, talking to people about this, going out on the street and supporting rallies and demonstrations are all extremely important for us, because we need to build the peace movement in this country. And I was given a notice of a film that's coming out. It's a premiere screening of the documentary film Enemies of Peace, Preventing the Next War in the Middle East. It's going to be on June 21st at the New York Society for Ethical Culture at 7 o'clock. So I've made that announcement. You can look it up on www.enemiesofpeacefilm.com.
Hey, but you know, folks, Brooklyn for Peace, if all of the people in this room became active in a group like Brooklyn for Peace, then we would be in a much better position to do the kinds of things that would allow us to build a movement against this kind of crap that's going on.
Absolutely.
So, you know, let's not say, what do we do? Let's start, you know, Brooklyn, there's the phone number.
And one last thing, please consider making a donation to Brooklyn for Peace on your way out the door if you have not done so already, so that we can organize more events like this one. And thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it.
And stacking the chairs.
Training.